Hello, Jewish historians. I am very excited to talk about our new topic, which is going to be the Jews of medieval Ashkenaz. One of the reasons I'm so excited about talking about Ashkenaz is because this may have come as a big shock to you, but I am actually an Ashkenazi Jew myself, as I know are many of the people in our class and in our school, not all, of course, and we will talk about the heritage of those who are not Ashkenaz also, and those of us who are a little bit of Ashkenaz and a little bit of other stuff, and it's all going to be great and very exciting. But so for now, welcome to Ashkenaz. When we think about Ashkenaz, often we think about places in Eastern Europe, like Poland, Hungary, the Ukraine, Russia, Lithuania, Romania, places like that. But the truth is that that is newer when it comes in terms of history. And we think about, maybe where our grandparents, great-grandparents, etc. So for the last, few hundred years in Eastern Europe. But the truth is the original Ashkenaz is actually in more to the west and to the north in Europe. So the northwest, not all the way west over here, which is Spain, because Spain is actually Sfarad, which is for another topic. But Ashkenaz is Western Europe, and we're going to talk about that right now. So first of all, where does the name Ashkenaz come from? Why is it called Ashkenaz? It's not the name of a country. So where did this name Ashkenaz come from? So the truth is, if you turn to Breshit Perek Yud, after at the end of Parshat Noach, so the Torah tells us, Eila toldot b'nei Noach, Shem, Cham, v'Yafet, the three sons of Noach, the famous three sons, Shem, Cham, and Yafet. The Jewish people, the Semites, come from Shem, right? Jewish people and other nations that come from Shem. And then the Torah tells us that they had children. So these three sons had children. And one of Bnei Yafet, one of the sons of Yafet is Gomer, and one of the sons of Gomer is Ashkenaz. Okay, so this word Ashkenaz appears in the Torah already at the beginning of Sefer Breshit in Perek Yud. And then, for some reason, that name became identified as the lands that we'll be talking about today and going forward for a little while that we call Ashkenaz. Why are those places called Ashkenaz? That's a good question. It's not totally clear. Not clear. It's what we like to call beyond the scope of this discussion. It's not clear why Ashkenaz from Sefer Breshit has been associated with these lands, but that's what it was called, and that's what we're going to refer to them. So when we're talking about Ashkenaz, so what are we talking about? What lands are we talking about? So those are, we'll be there in a second. So I guess before we begin the discussion, before we get into specifics, we want to talk about the concept of generalizations. So what we're going to be saying is totally true in general. So there are some ideas that we're going to be talking about that are not true of every single Ashkenazi Jew, that are not true of every single experience that the Jews had for over a course of 1,000 years in Ashkenaz. So it's important to understand that what we're talking about is true in general. We're going to talk about how Jews got to Ashkenaz. We're going to talk about how that's true in general. There are exceptions to those rules, and that's always important to keep in mind, that it's not that every single Jew came this way and lived this way and did these things. It's very important to keep that in mind, that what we're saying is true in general. There are exceptions to the rule, and it's very, very important to keep in the back of our head as we learn about this, because sometimes we're going to come across exceptions to the rules, and we're going to say, wait a minute, that's not what we talked about when we talked about Ashkenazi Jews. But the truth is that it's okay to find exceptions to the rules, because what we're talking about is true in general, and as a rule, this is what happened for Ashkenazi Jews, but it's not the truth that every single Ashkenazi Jew lived a certain way. It's true as a rule for the most part. Okay, so where are we and how did we get here? So you see this map, and it's not that clear, but don't worry about it. It's just that there are arrows and lines describing where Jews traveled all the way from down here from Judea and Jerusalem to Ashkenaz, to Sfard, to the east, to Babylonia. And, where are we? How did we get here? Over the next 2,000 years, the Jews went all over the place. And how did that happen? Where did they go? Why did they go where they went? So these are all very important questions, and we're going to get to them. Okay, so I told you before that we're going to talk about what these places of Ashkenaz are. When we see on our Google Earth map here, this is obviously, countries today. These borders weren't exactly the same, and not all of these countries existed 1,000 years ago, but it's helpful to see the map now as what it looks like today. And so, like I said, in Eastern Europe, like Ukraine, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, or a lot of our great grandparents were born in Czechoslovakia, right? So these Eastern European countries, a lot of times what we think about when we think about Ashkenaz and we think about speaking Yiddish and things like that, and having cholent and kugel, those are later though, because the original Ashkenaz, what we may call the OG Ashkenazim, are in countries like Germany. Here are three very important communities in Germany called Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. They're sometimes referred to as Kehilot Shum, which means garlic, but it stands for Shin Vav Mem. Spires, Verms or Vermiser, and Mainz. You might know someone named Shapiro. Shapiro is someone that came from Spires. Usually, maybe it's true, again, in general, but not necessarily ours. So these three communities that are right here on the Rhine River in Germany were three very important Ashkenazi communities. And then over here we have France, so northern France specifically. So you see down here, south of France, we don't see so many Jewish communities, at least not yet, but in northern France. So we have Germany, a lot of Jews in Germany, this is Ashkenaz, and we have Jews in France, in northern France over here, even further away from Germany, like Normandy and other places in the northwestern France, northeastern France, and then up here in England. So we have places like London and York and other Canterbury, other places in England. So these are the 3 or 2.5, if you only count the northern half of France, Germany, and England, right? So those are the countries that what we refer to when we talk about Ashkenaz. How did Jews get to Ashkenaz? We know that Jews, of course, came from Judea, right? So how did the Jews end up getting all the way over here in Ashkenaz? And this is where, for a long time, one of the centers for part of Jewish history, maybe the most important center of Judaism, is in Ashkenaz. So how did that happen? How did Jews go from all the way down here in Judea up to Ashkenaz? So we know that in different persecutions by the Romans, Jews were exiled, Jews were sold into slavery, and Jews maybe in Rome, there may have been better opportunities for Jews elsewhere in the Roman Empire than in Judea. We learned about how difficult it was, how much persecution there was in Judea. So Jews, again, like I said, as a rule, there are exceptions, right? There are Jews that came maybe through North Africa, up through Sfarad, and then somehow found their way into Ashkenaz. There might have been Jews that went to Bavel over here, which is a modern-day Iraq, and then may have come another way to Ashkenaz. But for the most part, Jews came from Judea through southern Italy, Rome, up north, and they established their communities up in northern Europe, in Germany, in France, like we said, northern France, and in England. So when did this happen? So there were small pockets of Jews, making their way north for about 1,000 years almost, from the time of the first destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash in 70 CE, and then after the Bar Kokhba rebellion is put down, more and more Jews are leaving Judea. It's becoming more and more difficult to live there. And we're going to learn also about, other centers of Judaism in the east, in Bavel, but many, many Jews are coming here into Ashkenaz from Judea. So they make their way north, and by around the 900s is when there really are big pockets of Jews and big Jewish communities, 900s, 1000, 1100, here in those few hundred years is when these communities really start to flourish in Germany and in northern France, and then in England, right? So 900, 1000, 1100s, that's really when this is happening. Some of the very famous people that we know from Ashkenaz, Rashi, the Balei Tosfot, the authors of the Tosfot commentaries on the Talmud, some of the important prayers in Ashkenazi Sidurs are written by Ashkenazi rabbis. So, this starts to happen around here, 900, 1000, 1100s. And these communities really start to grow and flourish. So why specifically here? Why do they come here? So it's important to realize that a long time ago, when there weren't cars, there weren't roads, there weren't trucks, there weren't planes. So a river is kind of like a highway. And a river allows you to send goods down the river and transfer things in an efficient way. And Jews were often good at selling things. They would buy and they would sell things. So we'll come back to the previous slides in a second. So Jews in Ashkenaz, they earn their livings by buying and selling things a lot, and they have connections, right? They have trade connections because they have family that maybe are living in the East. They may know other Jews that are living out in the East or in the West in Sfarad. And so they have some connections that they could, help connect communities that are making goods in one area and then want to sell goods in another area. So the Jews are it's very helpful to have Jews who have those kinds of connections, and they're good at buying and selling things and kind of making a profit off of that. And that's how many communities end up making their living. So, you start small and then you grow and you grow, and that's how these communities end up developing. So it's also important to understand that at this time in history, in the medieval period, the two big powers in the world are the Muslims and the Christians. So we started talking about Christianity and the other day because that's important for understanding Jews in Ashkenaz. So the Jews of Ashkenaz are the Jews that generally lived under the Christians. There are some Jews in Spain that also lived under Christians. We'll get into that later because it's kind of a different community. But the most important thing is the two big powers in the world are Islam that comes into existence in the 7th century and Christianity that comes into existence in really the 1st century CE, but gains power over the next few hundred years. So those are the two main powers in the world that the Jews are living in their community when they're developing their communities in the Middle Ages. So it's important to understand how were the Jews perceived and treated by their Christian neighbors in medieval Europe, in Ashkenaz. And in order to understand that, one of the things that we're going to look at first is how did they earn a living? So like we said before, originally Ashkenazi Jews came to these communities, and they were seen as very helpful because they were able to buy and sell things, which is helpful for any economy, right? That has stuff to sell. And there are these Jews that would come. They were good at money. They had trade networks. They had connections, and they were able to help develop these economies. So originally they came as merchants. Some of them ended up becoming, having enough money they could become winemakers. Rashi, some of the Baalei Tosfot were winemakers. We call it vintners. So they would buy and sell things, they would make wine, and eventually later on, a few hundred years later, they became moneylenders because they were able to lend with interest. Christians were not allowed to lend with interest, but we know that, in order to have a business, you really need to be able to lend with interest. Because, people need to borrow money. If you want to sell stuff, you want to sell lemonade, you need to buy a lot of lemons, and you need to, buy cups and things like that, and you might not have that money right now, but you borrow from someone else and then you pay them back later, but you can make money off that. So any economy really needs money lending, and the Jews helped economies develop, but they also got themselves into trouble, and we'll kind of see more about that later. But there were limitations on what the Jews could do. They could not own land for the most part, so if they couldn't own land, they couldn't really be farmers. So a lot of what they had to do was do trades. They had to be shoemakers, they had to be tailors, they had to be bakers, things like that, because they couldn't own land. And then there was something called guilds. And in guilds were basically kind of like a club where people would, learn a trade and they would develop those skills. But in order to, if you have so many people who could be, shoemakers or tailors or things like that, so then it makes it hard for the other shoemakers and tailors. And what that ends up creating is a situation in which Jews kind of got locked out. A lot of times Jews were not allowed to enter guilds. And if you couldn't enter a guild, then you couldn't learn how to do those jobs. And if you couldn't learn how to do those jobs, then you couldn't, you were limited in the kind of living that you could make. So the Jews were excluded from guilds. And so they were really limited in the kinds of things they could do. And again, it comes back to that's why they ended up being merchants. They would buy and sell things, and moneylenders, because they weren't often allowed to learn how to develop some of those other skills. So how was life for Jews? So we could say, fine, I guess, as long as, unless you mean other than, crusades, which we'll talk about, blood libels, lies that were told about Jews doing terrible things, the exclusion from the guilds, preventing from owning land, accusations of basically being responsible for all the terrible things that happened to humanity and to Christians, being blamed for those things, being accused of kind of being like a part devil, having horns, having tails like the devil, those kinds of things. So how do Jews relate to the Christians in Ashkenaz? So, take a guess, right? If that's how people treat you, so then you're less likely to want to kind of partner with them, learn from them, interact with them, and you're going to be suspicious of them. So the Christians kind of had a mentality of, we don't like the Jews, and the Jews often had a mentality of, we don't like the Christians if they're going to be so negative, be so exclusive, exclusionary, and so mean. So here are some of the things which we'll talk more about later on in the year, but some ideas of, the Jewish community, very traditional, very religious, and insular community, a lot